Hey there, and welcome to today's Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to guide you through this one. We're diving deep into the psychology of one of the most powerful and, let's be real, most relatable patterns of the human mind. We're going to map out exactly how our brains can sometimes build these massive, complex, emotional worlds out of, well, the tiniest little pieces of evidence. It's really a journey into understanding how our own internal motivations totally shape our attachments.
What if the relationship becomes strongest when the person is absent? I know, it sounds like a complete contradiction, right? But just sit with that for a second. We almost always assume that human connection grows through presence, shared time, actual back and forth communication. But today, we're going to look at this fascinating and honestly kind of startling reality of how an attachment can actually deepen, intensify, and sustain itself during periods of total silence.
This explainer is a Lovers Production, Pattern Loops, Episode 5. And as we map out this pattern today, just remember, there's absolutely zero judgment here. We're simply bringing some awareness to a beautifully complex mechanism of the human mind.
Okay, let's dive into this by comparing two parallel tracks. On one hand, we've got what happened, which is the objective, observable reality. And on the other, we have what imagination completed, the subjective, internal fantasy. The core idea here is that when reality is incomplete or a bit ambiguous, our minds literally rush in to fill those gaps with possibilities. And when we repeatedly imagine those possibilities, we can actually reinforce our attachment to a projected version of a person instead of the actual person themselves. Let's look at exactly how this plays out in real life.
So here's a really illustrative case. Just look at how this timeline unfolds. On day one, two people share this one highly emotional, genuinely wonderful evening. The connection, it's totally real. But by week 2, the actual external contact becomes pretty sporadic. The external timeline essentially just stalls out. But look over at the internal timeline. By month 1, there's imagined repair. By month 3, there's a fully fleshed out imagined future. We're talking trips, deep conversations, emotional resolutions. The absolute crucial takeaway here is that while the external timeline stopped cold, the internal timeline kept racing forward powerfully. The emotion this person is feeling is 100% authentic, even though the actual evidence for the relationship is, well, remarkably weak.
So how does that actually happen? Well, here's the exact mechanism of the fantasy reinforcement loop. It usually kicks off with step 1, which is just an incredibly small, real cue. It might be a song, an old photo, or honestly, even just a moment of absence or an unanswered text. Then, in step 2, the mind expands that little cue into a massive interpretation. That naturally leads right into step 3, the creation of an imagined scene or future. Now, step 4 is critical. That imagination actually produces a real emotional reward, like a sudden relief from loneliness or a huge burst of romance. And finally, step 5, that reward leads to increased attachment. You are literally self-generating the emotional reward without any new relational evidence whatsoever.
Let's move to and see how this builds into what we call the lover's map, mapping the internal architecture. We can really understand these distinct internal systems using this map. It's all about outlining our motivations, our protections, our meaning-making, and our actions. So, the loop is triggered by something small, like a single message or just silence. Then, our 4 internal systems fire up. First, hearts. This represents our motivation. I want the intimacy and the future this connection promises. Then we have spades, representing our protection. It's that feeling of reality might remove this possibility, so living in uncertainty actually feels a bit safer than a definite loss. Next are diamonds, representing how we make meaning, literally interpreting these ambiguous cues as destined or uniquely special. And finally, clubs. This represents our behavior, replaying memories, waiting around, and treating possibility as if it were actual evidence.
Now, you might be wondering, why do we keep doing this if it ultimately causes us distress? Well, the immediate rewards of this loop are incredibly powerful. You get comfort, emotional intensity, a strong sense of identity, and profound hope. It's basically a temporary escape. But the long-term consequence is what we really need to watch out for. That consequence is a greater, ever-deepening attachment to a relationship that might exist almost entirely internally. The imagined relationship becomes vastly more developed than the one you're actually living.
Let's move on to an important distinction, separating hope from fantasy.
It is absolutely vital that we make a clear distinction here. Imagination is a beautiful, necessary human capacity. It supports creativity, planning, and intimacy. We should never, ever shame our own capacity to hope. The concern really only pops up when we lose the line between what actually happened and what we simply hoped for. Because actually, research shows that positive perceptions, sometimes they call them positive illusions, can really support relationship satisfaction.
But this useful positive perception has very specific boundaries. It develops inside an actual reciprocal relationship. It remains fully compatible with observable behavior, and crucially, it allows faults and limits to just exist. It doesn't require constant reinterpretation of harm or absence. It is just ordinary, healthy relationship optimism.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how we contrast that with fantasy dominance. This is the exact moment when imagination begins to replace observation. Fantasy dominance depends almost entirely on potential. It actively minimizes repeated contradictory evidence. It treats those rare, fleeting moments of connection as the real person, while kind of just ignoring their consistent, everyday behavior. And most tellingly, it makes the imagined future emotionally more important than the current, lived reality.
So you might be thinking, shouldn't a lack of evidence or bad behavior just break the loop? Not necessarily. The human mind is incredible at handling contradiction by simply building more stories. When the reality doesn't match the fantasy, distance is rewritten as a fear of intimacy. Silence is suddenly interpreted as hidden, overwhelming emotion. Unavailability? Oh, that's just bad timing. And sure, any of these explanations could technically be true in a very specific case, but the trap here is treating a possible, preferred explanation as an established, cold, hard fact simply because it preserves the future you so desperately desire.
Section 4. Interrupting the pattern. Observing without judgment. Let's look at a practical way to break this cycle.
And this brilliantly illustrates how we can step back from the edge. The next time you find your mind spinning a tiny cue into an entire relationship narrative, try applying these 4 simple labels. Pause and ask yourself, is this a fact, like something objectively observable? Is it an interpretation, the personal spin I'm assigning to it? Is it a possibility, something that could happen but definitely hasn't yet? Or is it a desire, simply what I deeply, deeply want to be true? Separating these 4 things is literally like taking a circuit breaker to the fantasy reinforcement loop.
Which brings us to the core truth we have to remember. A fantasy can preserve hope. It cannot provide evidence. The feelings your imagination generates are authentic and entirely real, but they do not prove that the connection itself is progressing. Distinguishing between a feeling and a fact is, honestly, the highest form of self-care.
I want to leave you with this final reflection. Take a deep breath and ask yourself gently, which parts of this relationship happened between you, and which parts happened inside you?
Know what repeats. Pattern Intelligence. Loversmirror.com. A Lovers Production. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Understanding our internal patterns is the absolute first step toward true clarity. Until next time, take care and stay curious.